Hello and welcome to my channel. In this one I'm going to be doing a drawing of a fawn on the river, and I'm going to be using colored pencils on sanded paper. So I'm going to be drawing a baby deer on the river. There's going to be some reflections, and I think colored pencils on sanded paper will work really well here. The paper I'm going to be using is wet to dry 1000 grit sanding paper that you can buy in the hardware store, so it's a fine sandpaper, and the size is about 9 times 11 inches. The pencils I'm going to be using are Faber-Castell Polychromos for the most part. For blending I'm going to be using bristle brushes, flat bristle brushes with a crop tip usually. Now let's start with the background. So the background is going to be kind of out of focus, slightly blurry background, and then as we get closer to the fawn itself, there's going to be some more details on the water, like some ripples and clearer reflections and things like that. But here in the back I'm just going to have some vague shapes. So I will be trying to imitate the surface of the water, and the surface of the water here is reflecting our forest environment. So there's going to be some greenish tones, there's going to be some darker tones, there's going to be some lighter tones where the sky is breaking through, all kinds of stuff. Anyway, let me talk a little bit about this blending process. So on this surface, colored pencils work pretty well. The only shortcoming perhaps is that they are not blended as easily as pastel pencils. However, you can blend them a little bit. What I like to use with these types of pencils on this surface is a flat bristle brush, but it has to be a stiff brush, and I also like to crop the tip a little bit. And you mustn't overdo it, because you'll just be moving the pigment around and digging it out of the grain of the paper. But if you blend a little bit, you will be able to create some smoother transitions between one color and the other, and just spreading the pigment around, spreading the color around. And here I'm adding some darker colors on top of the mid-tone green that I used. This is like the mid-tone green that I used was like a yellowish green, light yellowish green, and then on top of that I put some darker green and a little bit of black colored pencil. And I'm blending that, as you can see, and I'm able to blend it fairly smoothly. Normally you wouldn't be able to do this on regular paper, but on this paper colored pencils behave a bit more like pastel pencils than they do like regular colored pencils. Obviously pastel pencils are still easier to spread and easier to blend, but these are on this surface colored pencils work a little bit better because they're easier to blend, and they're also easier to layer. This is one of the main reasons why I picked these materials for this scene, because I'm going to be adding a lot of lighter details later, and I'm going to be adding those lighter details on top of the darker layers. On regular paper that would be very, very difficult for me to do, almost impossible, and I would have to try some other tricks and techniques in order to achieve similar effects. Here I will be able to draw with lighter pencils on top of the darker ones with ease. I will easily put very sharp, well-defined marks on top of the darker areas, and that will make my job a lot easier. When it comes to these complex scenes, being able to work both from dark to light and from light to dark is a huge advantage. Anyway, I'm doing a little bit more of the background. It doesn't really look like much now, but the thing is that it doesn't really have to, because like I said, it's the background and much of it is going to be kind of blurry, so I don't really have to worry about drawing any specific shapes or anything like that. All I have to do is try to imitate the surface of the water and some reflections in it, because you can see that I'm trying to imitate some ripples and some reflections of objects above the water which are distorted by those ripples. So I'm drawing interrupted shapes, or I'm interrupting those shapes with the details of lighter value. Here and there I'm going to throw in some lighter details, like maybe we can see reflections of, I don't know, some lighter objects, or maybe a little bit of the light from the sky is coming through. It doesn't really matter what it is, but I want to include that as well. The reference will be in the description. As for the materials, I already explained what they are, but in addition to the Faber-Castell Polychromos colored pencils, I'm also going to use some Koh-i-Noor colored pencils. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. Now I'm using a light phthalo blue to draw some of these lighter reflections. So you can see that some of these ripples in the water are a little bit darker, others are a little bit lighter. That's because some parts of the water are reflecting some darker shapes or darker objects above the water, and other parts of those ripples of that water are reflecting some lighter shapes. Now here what we can see with these lighter bluish shapes is maybe the light of the sky, and the background is coming through the canopies, through the branches and the foliage, and that's why we can see some of those bluish details. And of course I'm drawing all of these shapes as interrupted shapes, because I always want to try to imitate that surface of the water, because all of these objects or all of these reflections will be distorted or broken into smaller shapes because of the ripples in the water. I'm doing a little bit more of the background here on the top right side of the drawing. I'm still using that yellowish green as a base color. I like it, it works pretty well, and I'm using it as a base tone or a mid-tone. On top of that I will add some darker colors here and there, so maybe some black, maybe some dark green, and then I just blend those. Again, trying to create shapes that look like reflections in the water because of all of the ripples. And there's only so much you can accomplish by just using one pencil or just working from light to dark. So sometimes in order to enhance those effects and make them look even better, it's better to work from dark to light, and that way everything looks a little bit more realistic. So I'm starting to work on the fawn now, or the baby deer if you will, and my base color here will be an ochre. This is an orangey reddish ochre, I suppose. There is also a brown ochre which is very similar to raw umber. I don't really know the difference between the two, there's not much, but this one is a little bit more on the orangey side. And on top of that I'm using some other pencils, like for example the cinnamon. The cinnamon has a kind of a pinkish quality to it, and for some of the even lighter details I'm using the ivory colored pencil, which is a light yellowish color, or a very how should I put it, off-white color, which has a bit of a yellowish component to it. For some of the darker areas I'm using the burnt sienna, which is like a reddish brown. So it's important to establish a range of value so as to avoid the main subject looking too flat. I'm not saying that I will be able to get every single detail that you can see in the reference, so that I will be able to describe the anatomy just exactly as it is in the reference, but I'm going to do the best I can, and I'm going to simplify things a little bit. And the same goes for these white spots or lighter spots of lighter fur. I don't really have to worry about their exact placement or distribution. I can just try to imitate the pattern in which they are arranged so that it looks sort of realistic or sort of similar to a deer. And as long as I can do that, that fur coat will look realistic enough. Anyway, I did the ear, established that base color. Now I'm going to add some darker details with a black colored pencil. And then I will draw some lighter details with an ivory colored pencil. You can see how light the ivory colored pencil is in comparison to the background and in comparison to the other colored pencils. It's almost white, but a little bit like a yellowish white. So I want it more like a yellowish white because in some places I will use plain white because I want a cooler tone, but in most cases because I want a nice transition between that ochre and the lighter areas of lighter fur. It feels more natural for me to work with an ivory colored pencil on top of the ochre. I'm doing a little bit more of the background here on the left side, and this time I'm using a black pencil, a black colored pencil, then some darker greens, and then some mid-tone greens, and then I'm just going to blend that. I used a little bit of soft synthetic brush. All of the brushes I'm using are flat brushes, but I used a softer synthetic brush to blend a little bit. The way they blend is a bit different. There are certain things that I can't really explain that well. You just have to test these tools and experiment for yourself. So for the most part, I like using harder bristle brushes, but sometimes when I'm working with colored pencils on this surface, but sometimes this synthetic brush comes in handy. Now I'm adding some more of these lighter reflections using a light phthalo blue. The reason why these tiny blue marks end up looking very realistic is because you're able to pull marks with a clean edge if you want to. This is very important because on regular paper you wouldn't be able to do this. You wouldn't be able to pull such a clean, light mark on top of a darker surface. So this textured surface allows us to layer not just pastel pencils, but as you can see, colored pencils as well. Now occasionally I can soften some of these marks if I want to with a brush, but sometimes I want some of these tiny clean marks with a very clean edge, because that way they really look like tiny ripples in the water. And the more random this looks, the better, because you want to have some of them grouped together like these larger reflections and maybe a few of them smaller ones here and there randomly distributed. Anyway, I'm going to rework this top right part of the scene because I didn't really like the way it looked and it needed a bit more value and a bit more detail, so now I'm working on that. The main part of the drawing process is still ahead of me, as you can see, because I still have a lot of work to do on the main subject. And with the main subject, it's not going to be that complex. The main thing here will be establishing some contrast between the main subject and the background, which is what I'm already doing, as you can see, because the lighter marks on the outer edge are creating a nice contrast with the darker parts of the background. So sometimes, even when you maybe don't see that type of contrast in your reference photo, you need to push yourself to create it, because it's important to have value contrast between the main subject and the background. That'll make the main subject stand out more against the background. So I added a bunch of these lighter marks for the lighter spots on the fur, and now I'm refining the appearance of the fur a little bit more by adding some other colors to it. Some darker tones with the burnt sienna, and some lighter tones with the cinnamon and the ivory colored pencil. Notice that I'm working on the ear, by the way, now, and this part is going to be a little bit darker because this part of the earlobe is facing down and away from the light source, with just a few lighter hairs inside here. So notice that even when I'm using lighter pencils, I usually will like to have that ochre as a base color. I'm drawing the eye and I put in the white for the reflection, for the catch light, and I'm just going to work around it now. I could add that tiny white detail later, but the thing is that if I have an opportunity to draw that bright area, that lighter area first, why not? Because that way I can be sure that it's going to stand out and that it's going to be completely white if I want it to. Just doing a little bit more work around the eye, because the fur will be a little bit lighter around the eye. And I think generally, from what I can tell from the references, that the fur tends to be lighter on the upper portion of the upper side of the body, and a little bit darker and a little bit lighter on the lower side of the body, so the neck area, the belly area, etc. Just adding a few more marks to the ear to make that slightly longer fur a little bit more believable. The body of the fawn is covered largely with very short fur, as you can tell. Here in this transition between the forehead area and the nose area, there is a little bit of shadow, so I made that a bit darker. That part is facing away from the light source a little bit, and the area just above the eye sockets is raised a little bit, so I'm going to make that lighter. I don't know if you can see, because the camera doesn't really capture all of the tiniest details, but I am making really short marks, trying to imitate the appearance of short fur. So when you want to create an illusion of short fur, there are actually a couple of ways you can go about it. One of the ways is just drawing tiny marks, which is very time consuming, but it has its place. You have to do that every now and then. But another way is simply dragging your pencil and allowing it to create a little bit of texture. That's the technique that I prefer most of the time, but I like to combine the two. And there are some veins here on the nose area, so I made those a little bit darker, or at least the shadow under them a little bit darker. And I'm just doing a little bit more work on the legs now, because first I will do the background or the water in between the legs to establish that darker area, and then it'll be easier for me to draw the legs themselves because I already have a clean outer edge. The reflection will also be a little bit tricky for a number of reasons. First, it's difficult to, if I were trying to make it look exactly like the image above the water, it would be very difficult to achieve that, and honestly it would be a little bit tedious to draw the same thing twice. But the other thing is that the image is a little bit distorted, and it's also a little bit darker in value, and the values are also a little bit different, as well as the shapes, because we're looking at that reflected image under a different angle that we're looking at the original image. So the shapes as well as the values are not going to be exactly the same. But like I said, the image overall will be a little bit darker because the surface of the water here is a little bit darker. And I'm using more of the black colored pencil here at the bottom, blending that with a soft brush, and then going in with some lighter colors and adding some details. I'm going to add quite a bit more of these lighter marks with a blue colored pencil, because we have more of those bluish reflections in this part of the scene. Like I said, the way that I interpret this is that the scene takes place in a forest, and some of these lighter areas are actually the light which is coming through the canopies of the trees. Anyway, I'm starting to work on the front legs now. At first I'm defining this transition between the neck and the chest area, adding a little bit more shadow there so that the legs would stand out. There is a tiny bit of longer fur here at the top of that leg, and then the rest of it is very short fur. I'm using the ochre, the burnt ochre, as base color, because when I put the ivory on top of it, the ivory doesn't look just like an ivory colored pencil. It looks like a very light ochre in those places where I want to create a more gradual transition. So that's why it's beneficial to use a layer of base color first, because there are ways to draw on top of that while at the same time allowing some of that base color or background color to break through. Well, the only thing that you have to do to achieve that is simply use less pressure with the pencil that you're going over, with which you're drawing the new layer. So less pressure and maybe a little bit less material, fewer marks basically, and that way you can allow more of the base color to break through or to show through. Here I'm adding some more of these spots, just trying to place them in a similar way in that I see in the reference, but not exactly the same because I can't really be bothered with the exact placement. And now I'm working a little bit on the texture of the fur, trying to draw some suggestions of smaller fur, groups of fur or clumps of fur, and trying to create suggestions of short fur, short hair. And I'm doing that with lighter pencils, of course, with cinnamon and with an ivory colored pencil. So here I'm back to working on the legs. I did one of the front legs, and now I'm doing the other one, putting down the base color first, using a combination of burnt ochre and some cinnamon, then drawing a little bit more background in between the legs. Just adding a little bit more green to that darker surface of the water. I'll go back to that later and maybe refine it, add a few more details if necessary. Now I need to add some lighter fur on top of that ochre to refine the appearance of that short fur on the legs. There are some bits of slightly darker value around the knee, where I'm simply going to use less of the ivory colored pencil in order to create that darker area. Basically I'm going to leave the shadow area there by not covering it with a lighter pencil. Another thing that I'm using, and even though it's very, very subtle, is actually the background color of the paper. The background color of the paper is a slightly darker bluish gray, and I can actually use that as a shadow color or a way to create some textures if I want to. And I can also use that color, that background color, to modify the colors that I'm putting down on top simply by controlling the amount of pigment I put on top of it, because I can make the layer more transparent if I want to, and if I want more of that background color to show through. So sometimes if I want the color to appear cooler or duller, I can simply use less of whichever color I'm putting on top of it, and that way more of that duller color is breaking through or showing through. Now if I want the color to be brighter or more saturated or more vibrant, then obviously I need to work harder to overcome the background color, and I need to put down more of the pigment, more of the material, more of those brighter colors, especially if I use multiple layers. So I'm doing a little bit more of the background here now on the right side, starting with a black colored pencil first and then adding a little bit of green. Now I wanted to say that at the beginning that in addition to the Faber-Castell polychromos colored pencils, I'm also using the Koh-i-Noor pencils. The reason why I do that is because the Koh-i-Noor silky black pencil is a bit darker than the Faber-Castell black pencil. Now if you were to use them alone on a white piece of paper, you wouldn't see any difference, but where you'd see the difference is when you try to apply these black pencils on top of another lighter layer. In that case, I feel like the Koh-i-Noor silky black pencil ends up being a little bit darker because it's a little bit softer. It feels a little bit different than a colored pencil, and that way when I want to make sure that something is really dark and I already have a lighter layer underneath, I will usually select the Koh-i-Noor silky black pencil. But of course it's not necessary, it's just something that I feel enhances the range of value and adds a little bit more to the drawing. Anyway, just doing a bit more refining on these reflections on this surface of the water to the right by adding some lighter green details. In addition to the yellowish green, I'm also using the May green. The May green is very similar because it also has that yellowish component to it, but it's a little bit lighter, it's a little bit brighter. So if I need some even lighter greenish values or greenish tones, I will use that May green. Here we have some more of these light blue ripples, light blue reflections, and once again I'm putting those in using the light phthalo blue. So at one point I wanted to see if I can make them look even brighter, so I put in a little bit of white pencil first and then worked on top of that with a light phthalo blue, and that seems to be doing the trick, even though honestly I don't really need these reflections to look too bright. I already have a sufficient amount of contrast, and I think I will actually benefit from the whole background looking a little bit darker and maybe a little bit, how should I put it, having a little bit less of a range of value than the main subject itself, because that way the main subject will draw most of the focus from the viewer. Now I'm starting to put in some details in the reflection, and this is going to be a little bit tricky because as you can see I need to try to position the eye properly and try to get its shape right. But then again, as I've already mentioned, some of these shapes will be distorted, so you can see that I'm already drawing some slightly broken up or distorted shapes because of the ripples. You can see by the ear that that it looks a little bit broken up in a couple of places. That's because I'm trying to imitate the reflected image in the water, and I'm trying to add a few ripples in there. Anyway, now I am adding some lighter details to the reflection, but you can see how I'm using a tiny bit of that ivory colored pencil and some lighter pencils because I already mentioned that I want the reflection to appear darker than the image above the water, so there's going to be less contrast and all of these lighter values will be a little bit duller and a little bit more subdued in terms of value. So I'm going to try to keep it like that, a little bit simpler in terms of detail, a little bit simpler in terms of the range of value and contrast, because I think That'll actually make it look more realistic, and it's also consistent with what I see in the reference photo. So I'm using a little bit more of the burnt sienna here, and I'm using a little bit more of that trick that I already mentioned by allowing more of the background color of the paper to break through. So I simply use less of the material, and when I blend, that material, that pigment gets spread a little bit thinner, and more of that darker and duller color shows through. And when I'm using lighter colors, I simply use less of that lighter color, and more of the darker layer underneath shows through. So with colored pencils on sanded paper, it's actually a great combination because it allows you to work in a very natural manner, almost as though you were painting. You can choose whether to create sharp, clean marks, which are more opaque, or you can choose whether to create slightly more transparent marks simply by using less pressure and less material in a particular place. So I'm putting in some of these light spots on the fur, but these are not going to be as light as on the animal itself, so the reflected image is going to be a little bit darker, and these spots are also going to be a little bit darker, even though they are lighter than the rest of the reflected image. Here and there I will add some darker lines to imitate the ripples in the water. And one of the things that I think is working out, that is looking good right now, is that the image, the reflected image, is starting to look a little bit blurry, kind of like it's really being distorted by the movement of the water. Another mystery that you may be wondering about is where's the fourth leg? Where the fourth leg isn't really visible in this scene because of the position of the body of the baby deer, and that's because it's behind the front leg on the left, and also behind the head. You can see just a tiny bit of it there. Between the leg and the head, and in the reflection you can see a tiny bit of it next to the front leg on the left. So most of it isn't really visible, and we're going to keep it that way because of the position of the body. Obviously we can't see it because of the angle of viewing. I'm trying to finish the background here, and I first laid down a little bit of darker value, and then my lighter marks will show up nicely against it. Now the marks that I'm going to draw here with this lighter pencil are going to be they're going to look a little bit like circular shapes. So like circular ripples in the water, and I'm going to have a bunch of them, maybe 2 or 3. But these are interrupted shapes, so I'm not just going to draw an elliptical shape or a circular shape. I'm going to draw it in a couple of these interrupted strokes so that it looks more natural, and so that we have overlapping areas or shapes of lighter and darker value. And we're going to have some of those lighter shapes going over the reflected image as well, so that we are further suggesting to the viewer that this is in fact a reflection and not a real thing, a reflection in the water. I used a little bit more of the white pencil here on the right side to make the bluish reflection a little bit lighter, and then I worked on top of it with light phthalo blue. I did a tiny bit of blending with a brush. By the way, I like to use multiple brushes when I do this because I don't want to muddy the colors. So I use at least 3 or 4 brushes for different colors. So you want to have more of them lying around. And now, after I did a little bit of blending, I'm doing a bit more refining by working with a pencil, and then a little bit more with a brush, and then just going back and forth with a brush and a pencil. Anyway, I'm almost done here. I'm going to put my signature in the lower left corner there. The drawing is finished. Thank you for watching. I hope you like it. Don't forget to check out my other videos, and for longer videos and more content, check out my Patreon. Bye bye.